What are you doing?
Night is upon us. It's past time we moved on.
Give me a moment. You could have left the fire going until after I was packed.
Apologies. It's been some time since I last shared the road with someone. My eye
is well adapted to the dark. I know. It's fine. Could you get that lantern going for me?
Igivo Imola.
Stupid ugly wretch, and all your stupid eyes. How did you miss it standing there?
No hunter worth his runes would let a wretch sneak up on them.
Then why didn't you kill it?
I wanted to make sure there weren't any other moon spawn nearby.
I don't see how that answers my question.
It's a working theory, but I'm convinced that wretches act as beacons that attract other moon spawn. If any were hiding in the vicinity, they would have followed this wretch to our camp.
Testing your hypothesis, then? Warn me next time you plan on using us as bait.
I intended to, but today was the first day you've slept soundly since you needed the rest.
I guess I did. I never thought of wretches as dangerous.
That misconception has doomed many travelers in the wilds. Just because something isn't actively trying to kill you doesn't mean it isn't dangerous.
It's hard to believe that knowledge isn't widespread by now. I haven't walked a road in the wild uninhabited by a wretch.
Research isn't exactly a priority for most Nighthunters. The majority of my brothers and sisters in arms don't take the time to study their quarry before killing it. Wretches in particular are typically seen as unnecessary to kill. Better to save an arrow or the sharpness of your sword than waste it on something without fangs or claws.
But you've decided otherwise. If you put this knowledge in the right hands, it could save lives.
Believe me, I've tried. I'm not writing this bestiary for me. However, it so happens that a life on the road rarely leads to connections with important people. The only connection I have is with Matthias Wren, the merchant lord of Elsbin, and he isn't willing to publicize theories. He says theories are riddled with holes, and holes in theories lead to holes in his pockets.
Sounds like a gem.
He's better than most of his ilk.
What do you plan to do with the bestiary, then?
If I can't find someone to publish it, the same thing as the one who handed it to me, I suppose. One day I'll either be too old to draw my bow, or I'll face something more dangerous than I am. Hopefully by the time that day comes, I'll have already passed on the bestiary to the person I choose to carry on my work.
The journal isn't of your creation, then?
No, and it's hardly my efforts alone that fill these pages. I hope to complete it before I lay down my arms. I owe that much to those I failed to protect.
And who gave it to you?
A good man.
You know, for a long time, I felt guilty for every patient father and I lost over the years, as though the fact I wasn't able to save them meant I had failed. That I wasn't fit to be a healer. You don't owe the people you couldn't protect anything, not when you've spent so long risking your life to help others. Nobody can be everywhere at once. You're a good man too, even if you like to hide that behind whatever mistakes haunt you.
You're more perceptive than I gave you credit for.
I'll choose to take that as a compliment. So how far does a wretch's beacon reach?
Hard to say. I've narrowed down the range, but I'm still working out the exact distance.
Well, if you're satisfied that there's nothing nearby, can we put that poor soul out of its misery? Whenever Father and I saw a wretch on the road, Father always put them down. He always worried that those people were somehow still alive behind all those eyes, trapped and suffering.
The sentiment is admirable, but incorrect. Wretches can only rise from unburied and unburnt corpses on the eve of a monster moon. No living person has ever been afflicted by that curse.
I hope that's true. Still, the desecration of the body after death is tragic all the same.
On that, I agree. Let's lay this body to rest, shall we?
Let's. I wish the eyes would stop moving when it was dead.
They do after a few hours.
Are you doing that necromancy thing again? It's a pity the craft is banned, when there's so much good that can come of it. Burning at the stake is still the punishment for the use of death magic, is it not?
Wretched deeds require awful consequences.
Even when those wretched deeds are for a noble purpose?
Even then, the only decision the Queen has ever made that I agree with is making the art forbidden.
Seems a bit hypocritical to use that journal, then.
If I could afford not to use such atrocious methods, I would.
There you go again. I'm just saying that there are times when such a tool could be used for good. I actually approve of what you're doing. It's not like this form of death magic is hurting anyone.
And what would an apothecary know of necromancy? I despise doing this. Tainting the dead with necromancy feels as wrong as allowing them to rise under the light of a monster moon.
Then why do it?
Most who die in the wilds are forgotten, their bodies left to wither and wander forever. Everyone deserves to be remembered for who they were, even if the only memory that remains is their last. I've already accepted that if there is such a thing as the Kindler's judgment, or the embrace of the kind mother, that my soul is already damned.
I don't think that's true.
I'm going to begin now. Take a walk if you don't wish to hear this.
I'm not going anywhere.
By Ethereum. Edric shuddered and pulled his cloak tighter for all the good it did. 2 weeks of hiking through the mountains of Scovo's Jaw was difficult enough in the summer months, let alone before winter had yet to end. The wind nipped at his skin, rudely ignoring the barrier the heavy fur cloak was supposed to provide. He should have known better than to purchase it off that Eoden peddler. How could they know whether or not a cloak worked against the cold if they didn't feel anything at all? But the job had come so suddenly, he wasn't given enough time to properly prepare. Scowling from behind his scarf, Edric glared ahead at the source of all his woes. The woman ahead strolled leisurely along the narrow path, gazing up at the cliff to their right. A jagged sheet of stone and ice towered overhead. Edric was more concerned with the steep drop into the Valley of White far below to their left. Normally, Edric would never have accepted a job this time of year. Even disregarding the weather, there wasn't enough daylight to safely traverse the mountains in a reasonable amount of time. The likelihood of being caught beneath a monster moon without any shelter in sight wasn't worth the pay. Not normally, anyway. The woman had been insistent. She called herself a chronicler and claimed that her studies were urgent. Apparently, she believed that she had found the lost tomb of Ascorinthium. Edric didn't know who that was, and he hadn't cared to ask. Of course, all scholars like to believe their work was some crucial study worth more than anyone around them could ever fathom. Edric had led plenty of expeditions just like this one. Bright-eyed city folk came strolling in from their bastions and insisted they knew something was buried in the mountains that would forever change their field of study. Something to revolutionize runic technology or banish the monster moon. They always returned south with heavier hearts and lighter purses. Edric told this particular woman, Citri, she said her name was, that he'd be happy to help, but ruins forgotten in the mountains for centuries could wait another few months. Risking an expedition this time of year was something only the most foolhardy adventurers considered, and then she had named the price. The pay was good, absurd really. If it hadn't been, he would have laughed Citri out of the bar without a second thought. She'd even agreed to pay him half of the sum in advance. He was regretting accepting the deal now. Until he tasted the ale and smelled the women the job bought. What good was the silver? Citri was younger than any scholar he'd met previously. Most of her kind came to Edric past the spring of their youth, clueless to anything that wasn't spelled out in ink. Much to his surprise, Citri already had a route planned out, and a good one at that. Looking at her plan, there were only two major flaws. First was the weather, which she'd already dismissed. The second, he told her, was that there were no ruins anywhere near the area she wanted an escort for. Edric explained that he and a dozen other guides had scouted those areas before and had come back empty-handed. Citri just shrugged and said that even if there was nothing there, she would pay him in full, so he had decided to stop arguing. In the following weeks, Edric quickly discovered that the only reason Citri had hired him was for protection against moonspawn. Her survival skills were adept, her endurance was impressive, and any suggestions to alter their route when the terrain grew treacherous was met with adamant refusal, because she needed to stay on schedule. He hadn't actually done much guiding at all. Thankfully, as of yet, they'd only seen a single frostworm, and it had been too young to be of any real threat. Edric stumbled to keep from bumping into Citri, who came to a sudden stop to check her map. Peering over her shoulder, Edric frowned. According to Citri's maps, this was where the tomb was supposed to be, yet as far as the eye could see, there was only stone, ice, and snow. Feeling vindicated, Edric looked back at the narrow ledge. They'd had to spend half the night backtracking instead of finding shelter. It wouldn't be pleasant, but at least they could start the journey back. If they kept pace, they could reach a safe house before the monster moon arrived. Citri didn't appear upset at all. In fact, the young woman nodded to herself, as if acknowledging that standing upon a random cliffside in the middle of winter was worth the king's ransom she'd paid. Edric was about to offer an empty apology and prompt Citri to start heading back when she removed her glove, revealing the pale skin covered in black markings. Runes, Edric realized with a shock, transfixed by the complex alien patterns. Just who was this woman? A mixture of trepidation and curiosity held Edric's tongue as he watched Citri place her hand against a crevice of packed snow and ice. She closed her eyes and the runes began to move. Or rather, they appeared to move. Upon closer inspection, Edric could see the marks themselves didn't so much as shift on Citri's hand. It was something within the black ink that stirred, causing ripples that did not extend to the surrounding flesh. He swallowed uncomfortably. Magic was not a thing of this world. Edric knew little of the ways of witches and Nighthunters, and that was how he liked it. Despite having abstained from religion since he was a boy, Edric found himself covering his left eye with 2 fingers. He bit his tongue to stop himself short of uttering a prayer. Superstitions didn't pay well. Citri shook her head and walked a few paces further along the cliff before placing her hand in another ice-packed crevice. She repeated the process 6 times. It grew no less unsettling to watch. At last, Citri nodded and beckoned Edric to come closer. She gestured to the snow and ice she just finished inspecting and told him to dig. Naturally, Edric had brought a pick and shovel in case they needed to clear a path. To use them here, on a treacherous, windy ledge digging into a random cliffside, though. It was absurd. Swallowing hard, Edric began to dig. Best not to antagonize a rune wielder. The sun was setting by the time Edric's pick punched through a section of ice, revealing an opening behind it. His shaking arms were nearly numb, but the sudden realization that Citri had actually found something spurred him onward. Regardless of whatever secrets Citri thought to uncover, they would at least have shelter for the night. Citri dove past Edric and onto the newly created tunnel. He cursed, pulling back mid-swing to keep from impaling her. It took another quarter hour of digging to widen the hole enough for himself to squeeze through. Past the frozen entrance, the cave widened enough that Edric could walk without his shoulders grazing the stone. Darkness quickly enveloped him, and he was forced to light his lantern. He shouted after Citri into the darkness, but received no reply save for the echoes of his own voice. Quickening his pace, Edric pushed through a particularly tight crevice to find a heavy wooden door. He blinked. A door? Here? In an unmarked slit in the mountains? He stared, stupefied for a moment, at the thick wooden beams laced with frost and held together by strips of black metal. The door was already open, and behind it was a staircase that descended further into the mountain. It was built into a section of stone that had been engraved with a branching pattern of interconnected circles and semicircles. On either side of the door sprouted a pair of wings. Another pair folded above the frame around several lines of text scratched into the stone. Most of it was in some ancient tongue, but Edric was able to interpret a single phrase. Golden eyes burn our skies. Edric took a step back, noticing only then that the walls on either side of him shared many of the same circular markings as the entrance ahead of him. Cracked and covered with hoarfrost as they were, he hadn't noticed them before. Citri had been right. But if she was the first scholar to uncover this tomb, then nobody else had been here in untold centuries. That could only mean this tomb was untouched by looters. Whatever wealth this tomb contained, it surely held valuable antiquities worth a dozen times more than the price Citri had offered. Was her intent to sneak into the tomb and abandon him here while she laid claim to the riches within? He gripped the pommel of his sword and descended. It was still frigid, but at least the wind couldn't reach this deep into the mountainside. At the end of this staircase, a semicircular room branched out into 4 different paths. On either side of the paths, shallow niches housed urns painted in the visage of some long-dead warriors who stared back at him with black, unmoving eyes. In the center of the room, positioned just before the staircase, a bronze statue sat lifeless. The thing was humanoid in shape, though its proportions were all just a bit too long. It sat like a discarded puppet, slumped over, its limbs splayed at awkward angles. The statue's smooth head bore no face, and was only marred by a single dark hole in the upper left corner of where a face should have been. Edric shuddered. Some of the other ruins he'd explored had similar statues. They were always unsettling to happen upon. Whatever their purpose had been, he could not say, but their mimicry of humanity was disturbing, especially since they were strewn about instead of being regally poised as most artistry tended to be. Looking around, Edric found himself disappointed. For a long-lost tomb, there was a notable lack of treasure to be seen. Alcoves in the wall contained only the urns, which seemed to be made of clay, and empty sconces. Most tombs built in the old world had all their wealth placed near the entrance. According to a theologian he once escorted, the god of death they worshipped at the time would take the wealth and leave if he found it before finding the soul of the individual in the tomb. If there was no wealth here, however, could this tomb predate even those times? Edric's grip tightened on his sword. Surely Citri didn't think she could escape with every valuable in the temple. He could just block the entrance and wait for her to return. No, that wasn't right. She was a scholar at heart, not a thief. Edric knew the face of an actor, and this woman was no liar. Besides, she needed his protection to get back out of the mountains. He allowed his grip to slacken. Still, with the way Citri had run off, he had no way of knowing which corridor she'd gone down, and tombs were almost always built like mazes. Another quirk of the beliefs of the time, presumably. The theologian he'd escorted had been prone to droning, and Edric had quickly learned to block out his voice. He paced between the 3 corridors, calling Citri's name to no avail. He was about to give up and just set up camp by the entrance when he noticed something. A thick black line of charcoal marked the stone of the rightmost path. Suddenly reinvigorated, Edric broke into a brisk pace, following the line down twisting corridors and branching intersections. Even with his experience in other ruins, Edric quickly found himself baffled by the sheer size of the structure. If not for the charcoal, he would have been lost in minutes. Eventually, he saw the light of a lantern up ahead. The corridor opened into a large room with a dome ceiling. Everything, the walls, the floors, even the ceiling, were decorated with the same script as the ancient dialect above the entrance. Citri sat among the symbols, furiously scratching notes into a journal. Her lantern was placed in the center of the room, casting a feeble glow that barely reached the edges of the chamber. She'd removed both her gloves, donned a pair of spectacles, and let her hair free. It looked golden in the firelight. What was so special about this room? Edric had seen numerous similar markings in the corridors he traveled. Why stop here and not at those other rooms or halls? He was about to ask as much when he realized that Citri was already speaking, not loudly, nor to him. He stopped to listen. Whatever the reason for that remains unstated. Notably, the winged imagery near the entrance and the mention of the many eyes stays consistent with the evidence gathered from Jazakai's palace and Hithrin's tomb. I have to admit that my patience wanes. Once again, all detail of the many-eyed remains encoded despite blatantly being portrayed in the artwork. Why is it that nobody is willing to speak of this? Edric cleared his throat. Citri glanced up just long enough to wave him away before returning to her rambling. At least she hadn't tried to make off with any treasure. With a sigh, Edric walked past her to inspect the room further. More tunnels branched in different directions, some sloping up and others down. Everything felt off about this place. It was more of a modified cave system than a meticulously constructed tomb. Why go through all this work anyway? The placement of the tomb was enough of a hiding place on its own. It seemed like a waste of gold to build such an elaborately confusing structure. A yawn escaped Edric's lips. If Citri wasn't intent upon looting, he may as well get some rest. No moonspawn could have survived in the tomb this long without food, so the place was likely safe enough. He laid out his sleeping roll and sat with his back against the wall, laying his sword unsheathed across his lap. He extinguished his light and closed his eyes, Citri's own flickering candle glowing against his eyelids. Edric awoke to total darkness. For a horrible second, he fumbled through his bag, worried that Citri had stolen his light and left him to make the tomb his own. When his hand closed around the cold metal handle of his lantern, he breathed a sigh of relief. Striking his fire steel to light it, as his heartbeat calmed, Edric turned from fear to anger. Where had that woman run off to now? How was he supposed to find her in this mist-forsaken maze? And what was that insistent noise? A distant clicking sound, echoed like a gauntleted hand knocking on a door. The charcoal, he remembered, and swung his arm around to observe the other paths. Assuming Citri hadn't gone back to the entrance, there were 2 other paths marked with charcoal. How long had he been asleep? Bristling at being left behind, Edric picked a path and stalked down it. Shouting had done no good before, so why would it now? Eventually, he'd see Citri's light, and when he did, he would give her a piece of his mind. He entered a crossroads at the end of a twisting corridor decorated with a spiraling pattern of feathers. The charcoal path veered left, but Edric found himself drawn to the right where a room full of locked chests waited for him. His scowl warped into a grin and he dashed toward them. Using the pommel of his sword, he shattered one of the ancient, rusted locks and pried the frozen, heavy lid open to reveal a dusty, moldering pile of books. His joy caught in his throat and he dashed to another chest, then another. Each held only old, moldy paper bound with tarnished leather. He bellowed a curse that echoed into the tunnels around him, for a moment drowning out that persistent clicking. Surely there had to be something of value here. Even the books, which may have once held value, were now unreadable. Edric sighed and turned back the way he'd come. Citri better have some answers for him. A faint blue flickering light greeted him in the tunnels. The unnatural glow sent chills crawling down his spine. It was probably just that girl and her rune magic, Edric figured. Nothing to fear. Probably. Edric drew his sword and broke into a brisk walk. If that wasn't Citri, he needed to beat it to the crossroads. He'd seen no other way out of the room and he didn't like being cornered. He wasn't half the swordsman he boasted he was to impress potential clients. Fleeing was always preferred to a fight. One thing did disturb him as he neared the crossroads. The light was strongest down the path he had come from, the path that led to the entrance. Edric came to a stop in the center of the crossroads and froze. Lumbering down the hall was the bronze statue from the entrance. A faint blue glow pulsed from inside its body, leaking out at the joints and through that single hole in its head which now felt like an eye boring into his flesh. It made no change to how it moved, nor did it make a sound to indicate that it had seen him. Edric took a step back, watching the statue click its fingers together like the pincers of a widow crab. It looked even less human in motion than it had when laying dormant. Limbs twitched and moved with no sense of unison like a puppet controlled by a retinue of different masters. Citri could go to the mist for all Edric cared. He hadn't signed up for whatever this was. He turned and ran, following the charcoal markings on the wall to keep from getting lost. Corner after corner he turned, and somehow the blue light always stayed just within distance, speeding up only when it was out of sight. Edric panted as he ran, Sweat poured down his brow and quickly cooled in the chill. How far into the mountains did this tomb go? Not far enough, it seemed. Edric cursed as he found himself in a room at the end of the charcoal with no other tunnels to escape to. This room was held up by 4 pillars, all decorated with the same foreign sigils that sprawled through the rest of the tomb. Edric felt a bitter sting of anger towards whoever had built this place. Why bother with such a complex construction if you weren't protecting anything? With a hiss, Edric backed into the room, drawing his blade. The light slowly approached, the blue of the statue drowning out the orange of his fire. It lurched toward him, fingers clicking, pace never changing. As it grew near, Edric could make out mechanisms beneath the bronze plate whirring and clicking, gears shifting around some bright blue source within its body. Then, with a speed it hadn't shown previously, it lashed out, knocking the lantern from Edric's hand, taking 3 of his fingers with it. Edric howled and swung his blade upward toward the thing's neck. Metal clashed against metal, and the shock of the blow reverberated up his arm, causing the sword to slip from his grip. The statue lunged, and only instinct prompted Edric to duck to the side, barely avoiding its grasp. He stumbled to his feet and took off into the darkness, nursing his injured hand. He spurred a quick glance over his shoulder to see the statue now stomping after him, leaving deep grooves in the stone where it stepped. He turned back ahead and rammed right into a wide-eyed Bestiary stepping out of a branching corridor. They tumbled to the ground, the statue closing in behind them. The statue clicked towards them with a hiss, like a hot blade cooled quickly in a barrel of water. It was him or her. Edric screamed, grabbing at her hair with both hands, preparing to throw her before the mercy of the bronze statue. A twinge of guilt slowed him for just a moment. As a guide, it was his duty to protect her, but what could he do against this metallic monster? Bestiary did not hesitate. She twisted out of his grip and rolled to the side. Edric's arms closed around empty air as the young scholar dove past him. A sharp pain in his ankle tore a cry from Edric's throat. In an instant, Bestiary was on her feet, a bloody knife in her hand. His blood, Edric realized with a start. He tried to stand, but the tendon in his ankle had been sliced clean through and he toppled over. The statue let out a whirring sound that almost sounded like a squeal of delight and descended upon him. Edric looked up, his face contorted into something between fury and terror. Bestiary glanced back at him. Blue light reflected off her spectacles, creating mirrors that hid her eyes, and showed Edric's own horrified face. Bestiary, cast in the pulsing blue light, looked as inhumanly apathetic as the statue that reached for his throat with those twitching, clicking fingers. Cold metal closed around Edric's throat, and with a crack, everything went dark.
I've heard tell of statues coming to life within ruins. Never thought the stories were more than looters making up lies to keep away competition.
Automatons are common throughout ruins of the old world. Most aren't active, however. The knowledge of whatever magic powers them has been lost to time. The ones that are active are hostile to intruders, both human and moonspawn alike. They will pursue intruders and remove them, alive or dead, from the ruins.
So, these automatons, they just murder trespassers and toss them out like a pail of slop?
Indeed.
Well, I guess that explains how Edric became a wretch. Do you think that woman survived?
Unlikely. It is reckless and foolish to seek answers in the wilds. Even if she escaped the ruins, I doubt she survived a journey without protection. Beyond the walls of civilization, there is no room for idle scholarly fancies. Even if something was to be gleaned from the ruins of the old world, what good is history if the mistakes have already been made?
What good is the Bestiary if there are so few willing and able to hunt moonspawn?
I suppose you have a point. Ultimately, my work is likely a futile endeavor, but I made a promise all the same.
That's not what I'm getting at. My point is that people need something to hold on to. Something to explain why the world is as broken as it is. Or in your case, a way to fix it, even if just a little.
I don't need you to justify my use of necromancy, Elise. I've accepted it as a necessary part of what I've chosen to do.
It's not the tool that's evil, Dedris. It's how you use it.
Your kindness comes from a good place. I can see that. But believe me when I say that if you knew the things I've done, your words wouldn't be so soft.
Maybe. maybe not. I'm no oracle, but I do understand people. If my father were here, he'd tell you that you're defined by what you've done, the good and the bad. Both are an equal part of you that remain forever, like a stain upon your soul.
And you?
I think stains can be washed away.
Some don't.
Even the worst ones fade in time.
I hope that's true. Come, we have much ground to cover before daylight. In 2 nights, there'll be a monster moon, and if we don't reach shelter, we'll both end up like this poor wretch.
I trust you know a place?
Indeed. Bea, a close friend of mine, lives in Felroot Forest. We'll have to travel an extra half a day to make it there before the Red Night.
Lovely. That's just what I wanted to hear.
Thank you very much for watching today's episode of Bestiary of a Nighthunter. Thank you very much to those of you who have decided to support this project on Patreon, with a specific shout out to Kyle Datu and Bridget.